IDD, the mail-order rifle. The Springfield rifle arrived at Cabanatuan prison camp in December 1943, wrapped in oil-stained canvas and carried in the duffel bag of Technical Sergeant Frank Morrison, a captured Army sniper from the 32nd Infantry Division. The Japanese guards confiscated it immediately, of course, along with every other personal possession. But what they didn't understand, what none of the other American prisoners understood either, was that Morrison had ordered this particular rifle from a Sears catalog 2 years before Pearl Harbor, modified it himself in his father's garage in Montana, and turned it into something no military manual had ever described. The other prisoners called it his mail-order toy, with the bitter humor that kept men alive in places like this. Morrison had tried to explain in those first weeks of captivity how he'd glass-bedded the action, hand-lapped the bore, and adjusted the trigger pull to exactly 2.5 pounds. But hunger makes technical discussions seem like fantasies, and after 4 months of rice and fish head soup, most conversations had shrunk to the basics: who was sick, who might die, and whether the guards would beat someone today. The smell hit him first, something between disinfectant and decay, mixed with the sweet scent of rice cooking somewhere beyond the barbed wire. Morrison stood in the back of the transport truck, his wrists still bearing marks from the rope that had bound them during the 3-day journey from Bataan. Around him, 47 other Americans blinked in the harsh Philippine sunlight, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Cabanatuan wasn't what the propaganda had prepared them for. No torture chambers or screaming guards, just rows of bamboo barracks stretching toward the distant tree line, and Japanese soldiers who looked as tired as the prisoners they were processing. One guard, barely old enough to shave, kept checking a clipboard with the mechanical precision of a file clerk. Another smoked a cigarette and watched the horizon as if he'd rather be anywhere else. Everyone out. Line formation. No talking. The command came in accented English from a sergeant whose uniform bore the dust of too many similar arrivals. Morrison climbed down from the truck bed, his legs unsteady after days of sitting in cramped positions. Beside him, Private Tommy Rodriguez from El Paso stumbled and caught himself against Morrison's shoulder. "You good, kid?" "Yeah, Sarge. Just need to find my legs." They formed a ragged line in front of what appeared to be the main administration building. Morrison counted the windows, noted the guard positions, measured distances with his sniper's eye, all automatic responses that felt strangely comforting. Through the open door of a nearby shed, he glimpsed something that made his chest tighten: the unmistakable outline of confiscated weapons stacked like cordwood. Thompson submachine guns, Browning automatic rifles, and there, barely visible behind a crate of ammunition, the familiar wooden stock of what had to be his Springfield. The processing took 2 hours. Names, ranks, serial numbers, medical conditions. Morrison watched the guards work with the same bored efficiency he'd seen in army clerks back in the States. No brutality, no screaming, just paperwork and the occasional bark of "next man" when someone took too long to answer. When they reached Morrison's rifle during the personal effects inventory, the Japanese sergeant hefted it with obvious curiosity. "This is not standard issue," the sergeant said in careful English. "No, sir, personal weapon." The sergeant ran his fingers along the modified stock, testing the smoothness of the action. For a moment, Morrison thought he saw something like appreciation in the man's eyes, the recognition of one craftsman evaluating another's work. "You made these changes?" "Yes, sir." The sergeant nodded and made a note on his clipboard before carrying the rifle toward the storage shed. Morrison watched it disappear behind the bamboo walls, feeling like he'd lost the last connection to the man he'd been before the surrender at Bataan. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, the senior American officer, appeared at Morrison's elbow as they were assigned to barracks assignments. "What did you tell him about the rifle?" "That I modified it myself." "Why?" Harrison's face was carefully neutral, but Morrison caught the calculating look in his eyes. Just curious, Sergeant. Might be useful information later. The barracks were long, low structures that smelled of bamboo and human occupancy. Thin sleeping mats lined both walls, with barely enough space between them for a man to sit up without hitting his neighbor. Morrison claimed a spot near the door. Sniper instinct again, always wanting a clear line of sight to the exit. As evening settled over the camp, the guards distributed the day's meal, a bowl of rice with small pieces of fish and vegetables floating in a thin broth. Morrison had eaten worse during training exercises, but the other prisoners attacked their portions with the desperate hunger of men who had learned not to waste a single grain. Across the narrow aisle between sleeping mats, a corporal from the 31st Infantry looked up from his bowl. "What's your story, Montana?" "Sniper, 32nd Division. Got separated from my unit during the withdrawal." "Any of us gets separated," the corporal said with a bitter laugh. "Separated, surrounded, abandoned. Take your pick." Morrison said nothing. He'd heard enough blame and recrimination during the march from Bataan to last a lifetime. But as he lay on his mat that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Philippine countryside, he found himself thinking about his rifle. 2.5 pounds of trigger pull, glass-bedded action, hand-lapped bore, every modification calculated to turn a mail-order sporting rifle into something that could put a bullet exactly where he aimed it, every time. In the storage shed 50 yards away, that precision was gathering dust. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. How long does it take for a man to stop thinking of himself as a soldier and start thinking of himself as a prisoner? Morrison learned the rhythms of Cabanatuan quickly. Réveil at dawn, rice and weak tea for breakfast, work details until mid-afternoon, another bowl of rice with whatever protein the camp kitchen could provide. The Japanese ran the place with the same methodical efficiency they brought to everything else. Not cruel, exactly, but utterly indifferent to American complaints about conditions, food, or the grinding boredom of captivity. The work details varied. Some days they repaired roads damaged by the monsoon rains. Other days they helped construct new barracks for the steady stream of prisoners arriving from Bataan and Corregidor. Morrison found himself assigned to a maintenance crew responsible for keeping the camp's bamboo structures in good repair. It was honest work, and the guards treated them like laborers rather than enemies. The supervising sergeant, the same man who had inventoried Morrison's rifle, even demonstrated the proper technique for cutting bamboo joints when he saw the Americans struggling with unfamiliar tools. "Like this," he said, showing Morrison how to angle the blade. "Bamboo has grain, like wood. Work with it, not against it." Morrison nodded and tried the technique. The cut came clean and smooth, exactly as the sergeant had shown him. "You learn quickly," the sergeant said. "What was your work before the war?" "Hunter, guide. Sometimes I built rifles." The sergeant's eyebrows rose slightly. "That explains the modifications to your weapon. Very skilled work." It was the longest conversation Morrison had with any of the guards, and it left him strangely unsettled. He'd expected brutality, indoctrination, systematic dehumanization. Instead, he was getting carpentry lessons from a man who appreciated good craftsmanship. The other prisoners had mixed reactions to Morrison's developing rapport with the guards. Rodriguez, who had bunked next to Morrison since their arrival, seemed relieved that at least one guard treated them like human beings. "Maybe they're not all monsters," he said one evening as they shared their rice ration. "Don't kid yourself," snapped Corporal Walsh from the 31st Infantry. "They're just waiting for the right moment to show their true colors. My brother was at Pearl Harbor, saw what these bastards did to our boys there." Morrison said nothing, but he found himself thinking about the guard sergeant's hands as he demonstrated the bamboo cutting technique. They were calloused from years of manual labor, with old scars that spoke of accidents and hard-learned lessons. The hands of a craftsman, not a monster. The first letter from home arrived in January 1944, carried by a Red Cross representative who visited the camp monthly. Morrison's mother had written it in her careful schoolteacher's handwriting, describing the snow in Montana, the difficulty of getting parts for the ranch truck, and her pride in having a son who was fighting the good fight against American enemies in the Pacific. "We know you boys are giving those Japs hell," she wrote. "Dad says to remember what he taught you about shooting straight and thinking clear. The whole town is praying for you to come home with stories of American victories." Morrison folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket, but the words sat uneasily in his mind. What victories? What stories? He was learning to cut bamboo from a Japanese sergeant who treated him with more respect than some American officers had shown during basic training. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had been watching Morrison carefully since their first day in the camp. Morrison suspected the colonel was planning something. There were too many quiet conversations with other senior prisoners, too many meaningful glances during evening roll call. When Harrison finally approached him directly, Morrison was repairing a leak in the barracks roof. "Sergeant, I want to ask you something about that rifle of yours." "What about it, sir? How accurate would you say it is, in the right hands?" Morrison considered the question. "In the right hands, sir, it's capable of putting 10 shots in a 2-inch circle at 200 yards. Every time." Harrison nodded slowly. "And in your hands specifically?" "I could put all 10 shots through the same hole, sir, if the conditions were right." "Even now? After 4 months of this?" Morrison looked down at his hands. They were thinner than they'd been at Bataan, and he'd lost 23 pounds since capture. But his eye alignment was the same. His breathing control was the same. And somewhere in that storage shed, his rifle waited with all its careful modifications intact. "Yes, sir, I believe I could." "Good to know, Sergeant, good to know." That night, Morrison lay awake thinking about the conversation. Harrison was planning something that involved precision shooting, which meant he was planning something that involved Morrison's rifle. But what could they possibly hope to accomplish in a prison camp surrounded by guards and watchtowers? Through the bamboo walls, he could hear the night sounds of the Philippine countryside, insects, distant water, and the occasional call of some bird he couldn't identify. It was almost peaceful, which somehow made everything worse. This place wasn't supposed to be peaceful. The enemy wasn't supposed to teach him carpentry or appreciate his craftsmanship. He thought about his mother's letter, about the town praying for stories of American victories. What would they think of Technical Sergeant Frank Morrison learning to work with bamboo grain from a Japanese soldier who had calloused hands and tired eyes? What would they think of a sniper who was beginning to suspect that the enemy might just be another man trying to get through the war? February brought the dry season to central Luzon, and with it a subtle change in the camp's atmosphere. More prisoners arrived weekly, Marines from Corregidor, Army personnel from scattered garrisons throughout the Philippines. Each new group brought rumors from the outside world: American forces advancing in the Central Pacific, massive bombing raids on Japanese industrial targets, whispered talk of liberation before the year ended. Morrison found himself assigned to help build barracks for the new arrivals. The work was harder now, with longer hours and more complex construction requirements, but the Japanese guards maintained their businesslike efficiency. The supervising sergeant, Morrison had learned his name was Watanabe, continued to offer technical advice when the Americans struggled with unfamiliar techniques. "Your people build with nails and screws," Watanabe observed one afternoon as Morrison wrestled with a stubborn bamboo joint. "We build with balance and patience." Both ways work, but they require different thinking. Morrison tried the joint again, this time focusing on how the pieces wanted to fit together, rather than forcing them into alignment. The connection held perfectly. "Better," Watanabe nodded. "Now you think like bamboo." The comment stuck with Morrison through the evening meal and into the night. Think like bamboo. Work with the grain instead of against it. He wondered if Watanabe was talking about more than carpentry. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had grown increasingly restless as the weeks passed. Morrison watched him during evening roll call, noting the way his eyes tracked the guard positions, the subtle hand signals he exchanged with other senior prisoners. Something was building, and Morrison suspected it would involve his rifle sooner rather than later. The confirmation came on a Tuesday in early February, when Harrison pulled Morrison aside during the afternoon work break. "Sergeant, I need to discuss something with you, privately." They walked to the far end of the work area, where a broken section of bamboo fencing provided some visual cover from the guard positions. "We're planning an operation," Harrison said without preamble. 6 key positions need to be neutralized simultaneously: the main gate tower, 2 perimeter posts, the armory guard station, the communications bunker, and the commandant's quarters. We've been studying their routines for months. Morrison felt his stomach tighten. "Sir, with respect, what you're describing sounds like a prison break, and prison breaks get people killed." "Some things are worth the risk, Sergeant. We're soldiers, not livestock. We have a duty to escape if possible." "And you want me to handle the long-range work?" "Your rifle is sitting in that storage shed, 50 yards from where we're standing. The plan calls for retrieving it during the initial phase, then using it to provide precision support for the close-quarters teams." Morrison looked toward the shed where his Springfield waited in the dark. He could visualize every detail of the weapon: the smooth action, the modified trigger, the way it settled naturally into his shoulder. In his mind, he calculated wind drift and bullet drop to each of the targets Harrison had mentioned. "What's the timeline, sir?" "Soon. Very soon. I wanted you to know what we were planning, and I wanted to confirm that you could make the shots when the time comes." Morrison thought about Watanabe's hands demonstrating bamboo joints. He thought about his mother's letter describing the town's prayers for American victories. He thought about Rodriguez, barely 19 years old and 3,000 miles from El Paso, who still trusted that someone in authority had a plan that made sense. "I can make the shots, sir, if you can get me the rifle." Harrison smiled grimly. "I knew I could count on you, Sergeant." That evening, Morrison sat on his sleeping mat and tried to write a letter home. The Red Cross representative had provided paper and pencils for prisoners who wanted to correspond with their families, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain what Cabanatuan was really like? How could he describe Watanabe's patient instruction or the strange absence of the brutality everyone expected? How could he tell his mother that he was about to risk his life in an escape attempt that felt more like suicide than soldiering? Instead, he found himself thinking about the rifle. Every modification he'd made in his father's garage seemed important now. The glass-bedded action that eliminated flex, the hand-lapped bore that ensured perfect bullet flight, the trigger pull adjusted to exactly 2.5 pounds. All of that precision waiting in the dark for one moment when everything would depend on his ability to put bullets exactly where they needed to go. Rodriguez appeared at his elbow, holding his own sheet of paper and looking confused. "How do you write to people who don't know what this place is really like?" he asked. Morrison looked at the blank paper in his own hands. "I don't know, kid. I honestly don't know." Outside, the evening call to quarters echoed across the camp in Japanese, followed by the mechanical sound of guards walking their appointed routes. Somewhere in the distance, Morrison could hear Watanabe's voice, giving quiet instructions to the night shift. "Soon," Harrison had said. "Very soon." "Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The escape attempt began before dawn on a Tuesday, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, and planned for months with the desperate precision of men who knew they were dying slowly anyway. Harrison had identified 6 key guard positions that would need to be neutralized simultaneously: the main gate tower, 2 perimeter posts, the armory guard station, the communications bunker, and the commandant's quarters. The plan called for stealth, improvised weapons made from mess hall knives and tent stakes, and the kind of coordinated timing that seemed impossible for men weakened by malnutrition and disease. Morrison wasn't supposed to be involved in the initial assault. As a sniper, he was too valuable to risk in close-quarters combat, Harrison had reasoned. Better to keep him in reserve, help with the wounded, maybe provide reconnaissance. But when the shooting started at 5:17 a.m., earlier than planned because Private Rodriguez had been spotted near the wire, everything fell apart in less than 3 minutes. Morrison woke to the sound of rifle fire and shouting. Through the bamboo walls of the barracks, he could see muzzle flashes and the chaotic movement of figures in the pre-dawn darkness. Someone screamed, an American voice, high with pain and terror. Then more shots, coming from multiple directions. The improvised weapons failed, the coordination collapsed. 2 Americans died in the first 30 seconds, cut down by rifle fire from the main tower. Harrison himself took a bullet through the shoulder and went down near the armory. Within 5 minutes, the surviving escapees had scattered back into the barracks, leaving their dead behind and waiting for the inevitable reprisals. Morrison found Rodriguez huddled behind an overturned table near the main gate, bleeding from a shallow graze across his forehead. "Sarge, I screwed up," Rodriguez whispered. "I was moving too early, and one of the guards spotted me. I screwed up everything. Easy, kid. You're alive. That's what matters now." But Morrison knew Rodriguez was right. The escape attempt had failed catastrophically, and the guards would demand blood for blood. Camp Commandant Colonel Ishida appeared within minutes of the shooting, flanked by 6 soldiers with bayonets fixed. His face was expressionless as he surveyed the bodies of the dead Americans. Ishida spoke English well enough to conduct interrogations, and his voice carried the cold authority of a man who had seen too many unsuccessful prison breaks. Line formation. All prisoners, now. They stood in ragged ranks, while Ishida walked slowly among them, studying faces and making mental calculations. Morrison could see the Japanese officers conferring in low voices near the commandant's quarters. 6 Americans had participated directly in the escape attempt. 2 were dead. 4 were wounded but alive. Under normal circumstances, the survivors would face immediate execution. That was when Morrison made his request, the request that would be remembered decades later as either the most audacious or most foolish thing any prisoner had ever said to Colonel Ishida. "Sir, I want to make you a proposition." The words came out before Morrison had time to think them through completely. Ishida turned slowly, his eyes fixing on Morrison with the intensity of a man evaluating a potentially dangerous animal. "You will speak when spoken to, prisoner." "Yes, sir. But I have something to offer that might interest you." Ishida took 3 steps closer, close enough that Morrison could see the calculation behind his dark eyes. "Explain." Morrison took a deep breath and committed himself to whatever was about to happen. "I'm a sniper, sir. That rifle in your storage shed, I modified it myself. I want to propose a shooting contest, myself against the 6 best marksmen in your garrison. If I lose, you can execute me publicly as an example to the other prisoners. If I win, these men who participated in the escape attempt face only standard punishment, beatings and reduced rations, rather than execution." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for hours. Morrison could hear his own heartbeat, the distant sound of insects, and the shallow breathing of the wounded Americans waiting to learn their fate. The other prisoners thought Morrison had lost his mind. Starvation sometimes did that to men, made them propose impossible bargains and believe in solutions that didn't exist. Even Harrison, bleeding and barely conscious, tried to talk him out of it. "Frank, they'll kill you anyway," he whispered. "Don't give them the satisfaction." But Morrison had spent 4 months thinking about that rifle, remembering every modification he'd made, calculating wind drift and bullet drop in his head during the endless roll calls and work details. He knew something the Japanese didn't know, that his mail-order Springfield, properly zeroed and in the hands of someone who understood its quirks, could put 10 shots into a 2-inch circle at 200 yards. Not sometimes, every time. Ishida's response came after a long consultation with his officers. "Your proposition is accepted, American. Tomorrow at dawn, we will determine whether your marksmanship is equal to your arrogance." Ishida agreed to the contest, partly from curiosity and partly from a samurai's appreciation for dramatic gestures. He selected 6 targets, wooden posts topped with steel helmets, positioned at various ranges from 100 to 300 yards around the camp perimeter. Each contestant would fire 1 shot at each target, with hits and misses judged by a panel of Japanese officers. The American would shoot first, alone, while the entire camp watched. Then the 6 Japanese marksmen would take their turns, using standard military rifles and ammunition. Morrison spent the night before the contest lying awake on his sleeping mat, visualizing each shot. 100 yards, almost insultingly close for a trained sniper. 150 yards, a slight adjustment for the crosswind that always came from the east in the early morning. 200 yards, 225, 275, and finally 300 yards at the maximum range, where the morning sun would create tricky shadows around the aiming point. He thought about his father's garage in Montana, about the careful hours spent hand-lapping the bore and adjusting the trigger pull to exactly 2.5 pounds. He thought about Watanabe's patient instruction in working with bamboo grain, and about his mother's letter describing the town's prayers for American victories. Most of all, he thought about Rodriguez and the other wounded Americans, whose lives now depended on his ability to do what he'd done 1,000 times before in the mountains of Montana, put a bullet exactly where he aimed it. On the morning of February 18, 1944, Morrison held his Springfield for the first time in 4 months. His hands shook, not from nerves but from the muscle weakness that came with prolonged malnutrition. The rifle felt impossibly heavy. The other prisoners gathered behind the firing line, silent except for the sound of men breathing and trying not to hope for something they couldn't afford to believe in. Watanabe carried the rifle from the storage shed personally, along with a wooden box containing 20 rounds of ammunition. As he handed the weapon to Morrison, he spoke quietly in English. "I've examined your modifications," he said. "Very skilled work. You honor your tools and your training." Morrison accepted the rifle and felt the familiar weight settle into his hands. Everything was exactly as he had left it. The smooth action, the modified trigger, the scope that had taken him 6 months to afford and install. Even the smell was right. Gun oil and the faint metallic scent of precisely machined steel. The first target stood 100 yards away. Morrison settled into the prone position, feeling the familiar pressure of the stock against his shoulder, the smooth curve of the trigger under his index finger. He'd lost 23 pounds since capture, but his eye alignment was exactly the same. The crosshairs settled on the center of the helmet. The shot echoed across the camp like a cannon. The helmet spun off its post and clattered to the ground, punched through dead center. A murmur went up from the assembled prisoners and guards. Morrison worked the bolt smoothly, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round. The second target, at 150 yards, required a slight adjustment for the crosswind. Morrison made the correction instinctively, the way a musician finds the right note without thinking about it. Another clean hit. By the fourth target, 275 yards, with the wind gusting unpredictably, even the Japanese guards had stopped talking. This was shooting that belonged in a training manual, not in a prison camp demonstration. Morrison's breathing had settled into the rhythm he'd learned during those long afternoons in Montana, hunting deer in the mountains with his father. Inhale, exhale halfway, hold, squeeze. The fifth shot missed. Not by much. maybe 2 inches high and to the right. But in a contest like this, a miss was a miss. Morrison heard one of the American prisoners curse under his breath. Harrison, who had been allowed to watch despite his wounds, closed his eyes and waited for the inevitable collapse that followed when hope died. But Morrison wasn't finished. The sixth target stood at 300 yards, the maximum range for the contest, positioned so that the morning sun created tricky shadows around the aiming point. This was the shot that would determine everything. 5 hits and 1 miss might still be enough to win, depending on how well the Japanese marksman performed. 5 hits out of 6 was the kind of shooting that impressed officers and changed minds. Morrison chambered the final round and settled into position for the last time. The rifle felt lighter now, more familiar, as if the previous shots had reminded his muscles what they were supposed to do. He found the target in his scope, made his wind call, and squeezed the trigger with the same smooth pressure he'd used to adjust it in his father's garage 2 years earlier. The helmet disappeared, not knocked off its post like the others, but completely obliterated by a shot that struck exactly where the chin strap met the rim. Even at 300 yards, the other prisoners could see the fragments of metal spinning through the air. What happened next would be debated for decades in the memoirs and oral histories that survived the war. The 6 Japanese marksmen took their turns, shooting with the mechanical precision that military training produces, but not with the obsessive perfectionism that turns a mail-order rifle into a surgical instrument. They scored 3 hits, 2 near misses, and 1 shot that missed the target entirely, a respectable showing for soldiers, but not enough to match what Morrison had just demonstrated. When it was over, Ishida approached Morrison personally. His face was unreadable, but his voice carried a note of genuine respect. "American, you have honored your weapon and your skill. The terms of your proposition will be fulfilled." The secret Morrison discovered in that moment, the secret that would change everything he thought he knew about the war, was written in Watanabe's eyes as he took the rifle back. It wasn't hatred Morrison saw there, or fear, or even professional admiration. It was relief. Relief that an American had proven something that Watanabe had suspected all along, that skill and honor, and the patient pursuit of excellence existed on both sides of the wire, that the war hadn't destroyed everything worth preserving about the human capacity to create something beautiful and precise and true. The immediate consequences were exactly what Morrison had negotiated. The escaped prisoners faced beatings and reduced rations instead of execution. Harrison recovered from his wounds and lived to see liberation. Rodriguez, whose premature movement had triggered the failed escape, never forgot that his life had been purchased with 5 pieces of lead and an impossible bargain. But the deeper consequences took months to understand. Ishida began requesting detailed reports about American sniper training, wondering if what he'd witnessed was typical or exceptional. Japanese doctrine, which emphasized collective action and standardized equipment, struggled to account for individual marksmanship that exceeded all expectations. Word of the shooting contest spread to other prison camps, other commanders, creating a small but persistent doubt about assumptions that had seemed unshakable. For Morrison himself, the contest marked the end of one kind of war and the beginning of another. The rifle went back to Ishida's trophy shed, but Morrison had proven something to himself and to the other prisoners that no amount of starvation or brutality could take away. He had found a way to be a soldier again, even in a place designed to strip away everything that made him one. The other prisoners stopped calling it his mail-order toy. They called it the rifle that saved 6 lives with 5 shots, and when they told the story later to wives, children, historians, and anyone else who would listen, they always emphasized the same detail, that precision and preparation could overcome doctrine and numbers, but only if you were willing to risk everything on the accuracy of your own judgment. In the weeks following the contest, Morrison found his relationship with Watanabe subtly changed. The Japanese sergeant still supervised work details and enforced camp regulations, but now their interactions carried an undertone of mutual respect that had nothing to do with military hierarchy. When Morrison struggled with a particularly complex bamboo joint, Watanabe's instruction came with the patience of one craftsman teaching another. "You're shooting that day," Watanabe said during one afternoon work break. "It reminded me of my grandfather's archery. He could put 6 arrows through the same hole at 50 meters. Said it was about becoming one with the tool, not controlling it." Morrison nodded, understanding more than the words themselves conveyed. "Your grandfather taught you to shoot?" "Before the war, yes. He said that precision was a form of prayer, a way of honoring the materials and the skill that generations of men had passed down." They worked in companionable silence after that, Morrison fitting bamboo joints with the careful attention Watanabe had taught him, thinking about the strange connections between a Montana hunting guide and a Japanese soldier, who both understood that excellence was worth pursuing even in the middle of a war. Liberation came in January 1945, when American forces arrived at Cabanatuan in a convoy of trucks and jeeps that seemed impossibly clean and well-equipped. Morrison watched the Japanese guards surrender their weapons with the same mechanical efficiency they had brought to camp administration. Watanabe handed over his rifle with a small bow toward the American lieutenant, accepting his surrender. Morrison wanted to say something, to thank the man who had taught him about bamboo and patience, or to explain that not all enemies were monsters. But the moment passed too quickly, lost in the chaos of medical examinations, debriefings, and the overwhelming relief of men who had learned to survive and were now learning to hope again. The journey home took 6 weeks. Ships to San Francisco, trains across the continental United States, and finally a bus that deposited Morrison at the depot in his hometown in Montana on a cold February morning. His mother was waiting on the platform, older and grayer than he remembered, but still possessing the fierce energy that had driven her letters across the Pacific. "Tell me about the war," she said after the initial tearful reunion. "Tell me about fighting the good fight." Morrison tried. He described the fall of Bataan, the march to Cabanatuan, the daily routine of captivity. But when he reached the shooting contest, the words stuck in his throat. How could he explain that his greatest military achievement had been proving to a Japanese officer that American marksmanship was worth respecting? How could he describe Watanabe's patient instruction or the relief in his eyes when Morrison obliterated that final target? Instead, he talked about liberation and the joy of coming home. He described the truck convoy and the American officers who had processed their release. He mentioned the medals they said he would receive for his service and his survival, but he never talked about the rifle that had saved 6 lives with 5 shots, or about the enemy sergeant who had honored his tools and his training. Morrison survived Cabanatuan and returned to Montana after the war, where he worked as a hunting guide and gunsmith until his death in 1987. His Springfield, recovered from Ishida's collection by American forces in 1945, eventually found its way to the National Museum of World War II, where it sits in a climate-controlled case with a placard that describes it as a modified sporting rifle used by Technical Sergeant Frank Morrison during his service in the Pacific Theater. The placard doesn't mention the contest, the executions that didn't happen, or the shooting that settled the question of American versus Japanese marksmanship in a way no military manual could describe. Some stories are too complex for museum displays, too dependent on context and character to survive the reduction that public history requires. But the men who were there never forgot the sound of that last shot, or the way hope could be manufactured from precision and stubbornness, even when everything else had been taken away. Rodriguez visited Morrison in Montana twice before his own death in 1983, and they always ended up in Morrison's workshop, examining the tools and techniques that turned raw materials into instruments of impossible accuracy. "Do you ever think about Sergeant Watanabe?" Rodriguez asked during his final visit. Morrison looked up from the rifle barrel he was hand-lapping, using techniques he'd learned in his father's garage and refined through decades of patient practice. "Every time I pick up a tool," he said, "every time I try to work with the grain instead of against it. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. What stories do we carry that we can never tell, and how do they change us anyway?